Elena woke up gasping, her hand pressed hard against her own collarbone, because the pain there felt like fire under her skin. The room was dark and cold, and for a moment, she thought she had dreamed it. But when she pulled her nightshirt aside with shaking fingers, she saw them again. Silver marks, shaped like claws, spread across her collarbone and down toward her wrist. They had not been there the night before. She was certain of that. She had checked herself in the mirror before bed, the way she always did, counting the small scars from training, making sure nothing new had appeared. Now there was something new, and it was unlike anything she had ever seen on her own body or on anyone else's. She sat up in bed and tried to steady her breathing, but her heart would not slow down. The marks pulsed faintly, almost like they had their own heartbeat, separate from hers. She touched one gently and hissed at the sting that shot up her arm. It was not an ordinary bruise. Ordinary bruises did not glow faintly silver in the dark. Ordinary bruises did not feel like something was still moving beneath them, searching for a way deeper into her skin. Elena lived in the lower quarters of the pack house, in a small room she shared with no one, which she had always been grateful for until nights like this one, when she desperately wished she had someone beside her to confirm she was not losing her mind. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and walked to the narrow window, looking out at the sleeping town below. Moonlight spilled over the rooftops, over the training yards, over the tall iron gates that marked the edge of the Alpha King's territory. Somewhere out there, in the grand hall at the center of it all, Damien slept, or did not sleep, because kings like him rarely rested easily. She had spoken to him only a handful of times in her life. He was the kind of presence that filled a room before he even stepped inside it, a man built like a mountain, with eyes the color of a storm about to break. Elena was nobody to him. She was an Omega who trained hard, fought harder, and kept her head down, because in a pack ruled by strength and rank, the safest place to be was invisible. But 2 weeks ago, during the autumn trials, Damien had watched her disarm a much larger wolf during a sparring match, and in front of the entire assembled pack, he had said her name and called her skilled. It had been a small thing, a passing comment, but Elena still remembered the way the hall had gone quiet, the way certain eyes had turned toward her with something sharper than curiosity. She had not thought much of it at the time. She told herself it was only pride talking, the pleasure of being noticed after years of being overlooked. But now, staring at marks that had appeared on her body overnight, she wondered if that single moment of attention had planted a seed of danger she had not seen coming. She dressed quickly, pulling on a long-sleeved tunic despite the warmth of the room, and made her way down the narrow stairs toward the kitchens, where the pack's night workers were already beginning to prepare the morning meal. She needed to see another face, needed to hear an ordinary voice, needed proof that the world outside her small room was still normal. The scent of baking bread reached her before she rounded the corner, and for a moment, it almost worked, almost calmed the frantic beat of her pulse. Then Mira spotted her from across the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, and the easy smile on her friend's face faded the instant their eyes met. "You look like you saw a ghost," Mira said, crossing the room quickly. She was shorter than Elena, quick-moving, with dark curls tied back, and a habit of noticing things other people missed. It was one of the reasons Elena trusted her more than almost anyone else in the pack. "I'm fine," Elena said, too fast, and Mira's eyes narrowed the way they always did when she caught a lie in the air. "You're not fine. You're pale, and your hands are shaking. Sit down before you fall down." Elena let herself be steered to a bench near the ovens, grateful for the warmth, even though sweat had already begun to gather at the back of her neck. Mira crouched in front of her, studying her face with the same intensity she used when checking a wound during training drills. "Something happened," Mira said. It was not a question. Elena hesitated. She thought of the silver marks hidden beneath her sleeve, of how strange and forbidden they felt, like something she was not supposed to know about, let alone carry on her own skin. She thought about what would happen if she told someone, and it turned out to be nothing, some strange reaction to stress or exhaustion. She thought about what would happen if she told someone, and it turned out to be something far worse. "I didn't sleep well," Elena said instead, which was at least partly true. Mira did not look convinced, but before she could push further, one of the older kitchen workers called her name, asking for help with a tray of dishes, and Mira sighed and stood, giving Elena a look that clearly said this conversation was not finished. Elena watched her walk away and felt a fresh wave of guilt settle over her chest, heavier even than the strange pain of the marks. She spent the rest of the morning trying to act normal. She attended her assigned duties in the training yard, running drills with the other lower-ranked wolves, keeping her sleeves pulled down despite the heat of the sun climbing higher in the sky. Every movement sent small shocks of pain through her collarbone, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it, the way she had been taught to push through everything since she was a child, with no strong pack lineage to protect her. It was during the midday break, while she sat alone near the training yard fence trying to catch her breath, that she felt it, a prickling awareness along the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She turned, expecting to see Mira again, or one of the training instructors checking on stragglers. Instead, she saw Seraphine standing near the shaded colonnade that connected the training grounds to the main hall. The Luna wore pale blue, a color that suited her fair skin and dark hair, and she was smiling in the particular way she always smiled at lower-ranked wolves, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Elena had spoken to Seraphine perhaps 3 times in her entire life, and each time had left her with an uneasy feeling she could never quite explain, a sense of being measured and found lacking. "You look tired, little one," Seraphine said, her voice carrying easily across the distance between them, smooth and pleasant on the surface. "Training too hard, perhaps, or not sleeping enough. A body can only take so much strain before it starts to show." There was something underneath the words, something Elena could not name, but her instincts screamed at her to be careful. She rose to her feet and offered a respectful bow of her head, the way protocol demanded when addressing the Luna. "I'm well, my Luna, thank you for your concern." Seraphine's smile widened slightly, and for one unsettling moment, her gaze dropped to Elena's collarbone, to the exact place where the marks were hidden beneath fabric, and Elena's stomach dropped, as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. It was only a glance, gone as quickly as it came, but it left Elena's skin crawling with a cold certainty that Seraphine knew something Elena did not. "Rest when you can," Seraphine said finally, turning away with the unhurried grace of someone who had never once in her life needed to hurry. "The pack needs its strong wolves in good condition. We wouldn't want anything to weaken you further." Elena stood frozen until the Luna had disappeared back into the shaded halls of the pack house, and only then did she allow herself to breathe again. She pressed her hand against her collarbone through the fabric of her tunic and felt the marks pulse beneath her palm, sharper now, as though they had recognized something in Seraphine's presence and reacted to it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Elena completed her duties, ate her meals in silence, and avoided any conversation that lasted longer than a few sentences, terrified that if she spoke too long with anyone, the truth would spill out of her before she was ready to share it. By the time evening fell and the pack house settled into its usual rhythm of quiet corridors and distant laughter from the great hall, Elena had made a decision. She could not carry this alone any longer. She needed to know what these marks meant, and she needed to know before they spread any further across her skin. She found Mira in the small courtyard behind the kitchens, sitting on an overturned crate and eating a late meal by lamplight. Mira looked up as she approached, and something in Elena's expression must have finally convinced her that this was serious, because she set her food aside immediately and made room on the crate beside her. "Tell me," Mira said simply. Elena glanced around to make sure they were alone, then slowly pulled back the collar of her tunic, exposing the marks beneath the flickering lamplight. Mira's sharp intake of breath told Elena everything she needed to know about how unusual this truly was. Up close, in the dim golden light, the marks looked even stranger than they had that morning, silver lines curling like claws across her skin, faintly luminous, spreading in delicate branching patterns toward her collarbone. "When did this happen?" Mira asked, her voice hushed, her fingers hovering near the marks without quite touching them, as though she were afraid of what might happen if she did. "I woke up with them this morning. They weren't there last night. I checked." "Does it hurt?" "Constantly. It got worse today. Especially after—" Elena hesitated, unsure whether to mention the encounter with Seraphine, worried it would sound paranoid or absurd. "After what?" Mira pressed. "After the Luna spoke to me in the training yard. She looked at exactly this spot, Mira, like she knew, like she could see through my clothes to the marks themselves." Mira's face had gone very still, the easy warmth draining out of her expression, and leaving something colder and more careful in its place. She glanced around the courtyard the same way Elena had a moment ago, checking the shadows, checking the doorways, before leaning in closer and lowering her voice even further. "I've heard stories," Mira said slowly, "about marks like this. Old stories, the kind the elders tell to frighten young wolves into behaving. They're called dominance marks. Supposedly only a Luna or an Alpha can create them, and only through old bloodline magic that most packs stopped practicing generations ago because it was considered forbidden. The stories say the marks are used to punish or control wolves who are seen as threats." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Threats to what? To status, to position within the pack. Mira's eyes searched Elena's face, and Elena watched understanding slowly dawn in her friend's expression, followed swiftly by alarm. "Elena, when Damien praised your fighting in front of the whole pack during the trials, who was standing beside him?" The memory rose in Elena's mind unbidden, sharp and clear. Seraphine, standing at Damien's side in her pale silk gown, her expression polite and unreadable in the moment, giving nothing away. Elena had not thought anything of it then. She thought of it very differently now. "You think the Luna did this to me," Elena said, the words feeling strange and dangerous, even as she spoke them aloud. "Because Damien complimented me." "I don't know," Mira said honestly, "but I think we need to find out, and quickly, before those marks spread any further. If they truly are what the old stories describe, they don't just hurt, Elena. They're said to slowly drain the strength from whoever carries them, until eventually there's nothing left to drain." The lamplight flickered between them, casting long shadows against the courtyard walls, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled low and mournful into the night air. Elena pulled her collar closed again, hiding the marks from view, though it did nothing to hide the fear now sitting cold and heavy in her chest. Whatever these marks were, whoever had placed them there, one thing had become terrifyingly clear in the space of a single day. She was no longer simply an overlooked Omega training quietly in the lower ranks. She had become something far more dangerous to be. She had become noticed, and in a pack built on hierarchy and hidden cruelty, being noticed by the wrong person could cost a wolf everything. Mira reached over and squeezed her hand, a small gesture of comfort that did little to steady the storm building inside Elena's chest. "We'll figure this out," Mira said. "Tomorrow, first thing, we go to Odette. If anyone in this pack knows the truth about dominance marks, it's her. She's been the healer here longer than either of us has been alive, and she's not afraid of Seraphine the way most of the staff are." Elena nodded, though sleep felt impossibly far away, as they finally rose from the crate and made their way back toward the sleeping quarters. The marks on her skin pulsed steadily beneath her tunic with every step she took, a silent reminder that something had already begun the moment she woke that morning, something with roots reaching further and deeper than she yet understood. Something that had already marked her as part of a story, far larger, and far more dangerous than the quiet, careful life she had built for herself within the walls of the pack house. As she lay awake much later that night, staring up at the dark ceiling of her small room, Elena could not shake the feeling that somewhere across the pack house, behind a closed door in the grand hall, someone else lay awake too, troubled by a pain they could not yet explain. She did not know, could not have known, that miles of stone corridors away, Damien sat upright in his bed, one hand pressed against his own chest, feeling an ache along the mating bond thread that connected him to every wolf under his protection. An ache centered on one single point he could not yet identify, a pain that felt disturbingly, unmistakably, like someone under his care was quietly, secretly, suffering. Mira knocked softly and slipped into her own small room by the time the moon had climbed high above the pack house. But Elena remained by her window a while longer, watching the shadows move across the courtyard below, wondering how many more nights would pass before the marks finished whatever they had started, and wondering, with a fear she could not quite name, whether she would still recognize herself by the time the truth finally came to light. Odette's healing chambers sat at the far end of the pack house, tucked behind a heavy wooden door that smelled of dried herbs and burning candle wax. Elena had visited only a handful of times before, mostly for minor training injuries, and each time she had found the old healer's presence strangely calming, a rare pocket of quiet honesty in a pack house full of careful smiles and hidden agendas. She arrived at dawn with Mira close behind her, both of them having barely slept, and knocked on the door before her nerve could fail her. Odette answered, wrapped in a worn shawl, gray hair loose around her shoulders, sharp eyes taking in both young women before they had even spoken a word. "Trouble," she said simply, stepping back to let them inside. "I can smell it on both of you." The chamber was warm and dim, lit by a low fire and a scattering of candles, shelves lined with jars of dried plants and small clay bottles. Elena sat where Odette gestured, on a low wooden stool near the fire, while Mira hovered anxiously nearby. "Show me," Odette said, once the door was firmly shut behind them. Elena pulled back her collar with hands that had not fully stopped trembling since the previous morning. Odette leaned close, studying the marks without touching them at first, her expression carefully neutral in the way that experienced healers trained themselves to remain, even when what they saw troubled them deeply. After a long moment, she reached out and pressed 2 fingers gently against the edge of the marks, and Elena watched her face for any flicker of reaction. She did not have to wait long. Odette's eyes widened slightly, and she withdrew her hand, as though the touch had confirmed something she had hoped would not be true. "How long have you had these?" Odette asked. "Since yesterday morning. They weren't there the night before. Has the pain changed? Gotten worse? Spread further?" Elena nodded. "It's spreading toward my wrist now. It was only near my collarbone at first." Odette sat back on her own stool, folding her hands in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring into the low fire as though gathering the courage to speak. Mira shifted impatiently beside Elena, clearly fighting the urge to demand answers before the healer was ready to give them. "These are called binding marks," Odette said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Some call them dominance marks, though that name doesn't capture the full truth of what they are, or how dangerous they can become. They are created through old bloodline magic, magic that runs through certain Luna and Alpha lines going back many generations. Most packs abandoned the practice long ago, considered it forbidden after the wars it once caused, but the knowledge was never fully lost. Only forgotten by most, and remembered by a few." "What do they do?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are meant to weaken and eventually silence a wolf the mark's creator views as a threat. At first, they cause pain, discomfort, a slow spreading ache. Left untreated, they begin drawing on the strength of the one who carries them, feeding that strength somewhere else, somewhere the marks were designed to send it. Over time, if the marks are not broken, the wolf carrying them grows weaker and weaker, until eventually their own body can no longer sustain itself." The room felt suddenly colder despite the crackling fire. Elena's hand rose instinctively to press against her collarbone, as though she could physically hold back whatever process Odette had just described. Mira made a small, distressed sound, and gripped the back of Elena's stool for support. "Can they be broken?" Mira asked, before Elena could find her own voice again. "Sometimes," Odette said carefully. "It depends on the strength of the one who created them, and the strength of the bond feeding them. Breaking a binding mark usually requires either the creator willingly releasing the bind, or someone with equal or greater authority intervening directly. In the old stories, only an alpha's true claim was said to be strong enough to override a Luna's binding mark, because true claims carry a different kind of power altogether, one rooted not in dominance but in genuine bonding." Elena's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything she was hearing, trying to fit these strange old stories into the shape of her own suddenly very real and very frightening situation. "Who could have done this to me?" she asked, though some small, frightened part of her already suspected the answer, had suspected it, since the moment Seraphine's gaze had lingered on her collarbone in the training yard. Odette's expression grew grave. "Binding marks of this precision, this strength, require significant bloodline power. Within this pack, to my knowledge, there is only one wolf living, who carries a bloodline capable of such magic." She paused, choosing her next words with visible care. "I will not accuse anyone without proof, child, but I would encourage you to think very carefully about who among the pack leadership might view you as a threat, and why." The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have. Elena thought of Seraphine's smile in the training yard, sweet and sharp all at once, and of the way the Luna's attention had settled with such deliberate precision on exactly the spot where the marks now lived beneath her skin. She thought of Damien's brief, careless compliment during the trials, a moment of praise that had meant so little to him, and apparently so much to someone watching from the shadows of his side. "What do I do?" Elena asked, and hated how small her own voice sounded in the quiet room. "For now, we slow the spread," Odette said, already rising to search through her shelves of jars and bottles. "There are herbal preparations that can ease the pain and delay how quickly the marks advance, though they will not remove them entirely. That kind of healing requires stronger intervention than anything I can offer alone." She returned with a small clay jar and a folded cloth, kneeling beside Elena to begin carefully applying a cool, faintly sharp-smelling salve along the edges of the marks. The relief was immediate and startling, a soothing coolness spreading beneath her skin, where fire had burned only moments before. "This will help you rest, and slow things down enough to buy some time," Odette continued as she worked. "But I must be honest with you, child. Time is not something you have in great supply. Binding marks of this strength tend to accelerate the longer they remain unbroken. I would not wait long before seeking a more permanent solution." "You mean telling the Alpha King?" Mira said quietly, voicing the thought Elena had been avoiding since the moment Odette began explaining what the marks truly meant. Odette's sharp eyes flicked toward Mira, then back to Elena, weighing something carefully behind her calm expression. "I mean that if a member of pack leadership has broken sacred law by placing forbidden marks on an innocent wolf, then yes, the Alpha King has both the right and the responsibility to know. Whether you choose to be the one who tells him, or whether the truth reaches him another way, I cannot say. But secrets like this rarely stay buried for long, especially within these walls." Elena sat quietly as Odette finished applying the salve, and carefully wrapped a thin cloth bandage around the worst of the marks, hiding them from casual view, while still allowing her skin to breathe. The pain had dulled to a manageable ache, though the underlying dread in Elena's chest remained sharp and unrelenting. The idea of approaching Damien directly, of standing before the Alpha King and accusing his own Luna of forbidden magic, felt almost impossibly dangerous. She was nobody within this pack's hierarchy, an Omega with no strong bloodline behind her, no powerful allies to protect her if her accusation was dismissed, or, worse, if it angered the wrong people. And yet the alternative, waiting silently, while the marks continued their slow, deliberate work beneath her skin, felt even more unbearable. "Thank you," Elena said finally, rising carefully from the stool, testing the eased pain with a small experimental movement of her shoulder. "For helping me, for telling me the truth, even though it's frightening." "The truth is usually frightening, child," Odette said, gathering her supplies back onto their shelves with the brisk efficiency of long practice. "That's precisely why so many people prefer comfortable lies instead, but lies won't heal what's happening to you. Only truth and time will do that, and I fear you have less of the second than you'd like." Elena and Mira left the healing chambers as the sun climbed higher over the pack house, casting long golden light across the training yards, where wolves were already beginning their morning drills. Elena felt strangely disconnected from the ordinary rhythm of the pack around her, as though she were watching the familiar scene from somewhere just outside herself. Everything looked the same as it had every morning before, yet nothing felt the same at all. "You have to tell him," Mira said quietly as they walked, careful to keep her voice low despite the distance between them and the nearest wolves training in the yard. "Elena, if what Odette said is true, you don't have the luxury of waiting to see if this resolves itself. Every day you wait is another day those marks grow stronger." "And if I'm wrong?" Elena asked, the fear finally spilling out in full force now that they were alone with the weight of Odette's words settling over her. "If I accuse the Luna of forbidden magic and I'm wrong, Mira, do you understand what happens to me? I'm an Omega with no powerful family behind me. Seraphine could destroy my standing in this pack with a single word, and no one would question her over me. And if you're right, and you say nothing, what happens then?" Mira countered, her own voice sharp with worry and frustration in equal measure. "You heard Odette. These marks don't stop on their own. They get worse until there's nothing left of you to save. I would rather see you take a terrifying risk than watch you fade away because you were too afraid to speak." Elena had no answer for that, because some quiet, honest part of her knew Mira was right, even as fear screamed at her to stay silent, stay hidden, stay safe, the way she always had. They walked the rest of the way back toward the lower quarters in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the morning sun doing little to warm the cold knot of dread that had settled permanently in Elena's chest. It was nearly midday when word reached them that changed everything. A younger pack member, breathless and wide-eyed, found Elena near the training yard and told her, in a rush of words that barely made sense, that the Alpha King had summoned a full gathering in the Great Hall that evening, that something urgent had happened within the pack leadership, that whispers were already spreading through the corridors about broken laws and forbidden magic. Elena's blood ran cold. She exchanged a stunned glance with Mira, both of them thinking the same terrified thought without needing to say it aloud. Somehow, someway, word of the binding marks had already begun to spread beyond the quiet privacy of Odette's healing chambers, and whatever was about to happen in that great hall that evening, Elena had a sinking, certain feeling that she was about to find herself standing directly at the center of it, whether she was ready or not. Damien had not slept properly in 3 nights, and the exhaustion showed in the tight set of his jaw as he paced the length of his private study, a room lined with old maps and weapons that had belonged to alphas before him, kings who had built this territory out of nothing but strength and careful alliance. The ache along his mating bond thread had not faded since it first began, that quiet, persistent pain, settled somewhere he could not quite locate, like a bruise on a limb he could not see. He had tried, in the privacy of these late hours, to trace the source of it, reaching outward through the pack bond the way his father had once taught him, searching for the thread of connection that felt wrong among the dozens that felt right. It was difficult, painstaking work. A pack bond connected an alpha to every wolf under his protection, hundreds of individual threads woven together into something like a tapestry, and finding one damaged strand among so many required patience, Damien did not currently possess. But he had narrowed it, slowly, over these sleepless nights, to somewhere within the lower quarters, among the Omega ranks, a thread that pulsed with pain, instead of the steady contentment he expected to feel from a well-protected pack member. He had not yet identified exactly who that thread belonged to, but the not knowing had begun to gnaw at him in a way few things did, because as Alpha King, the protection of every single wolf beneath him was not simply a duty, it was woven into the very fabric of what made him who he was. A wolf in pain within his own territory, hidden from him, unexplained, felt like a personal failure he could not ignore. Gareth, his head enforcer, and closest advisor since childhood, found him still pacing well past midnight, and did not bother knocking before letting himself into the study. He was a broad-shouldered man, with a scar along one cheek from an old border skirmish, and he had long since earned the right to speak plainly to his king without ceremony. "You look like death," Gareth said, dropping into one of the heavy wooden chairs near the cold fireplace. "Sit down before you wear a groove into my floor." "It's my floor," Damien said, though he stopped pacing anyway, running a hand roughly through his dark hair. "Something is wrong within the pack, Gareth. I can feel it. Has been feeling it for days now, and I still haven't found the source. The pain you mentioned before, it's getting worse, sharper. Whatever is causing it isn't resolving on its own, it's spreading." Damien finally sank into the chair across from his old friend, the weight of days without proper rest settling heavily over him. "I've narrowed it to the lower quarters, somewhere among the Omega ranks, but there are dozens of wolves living there. I can't isolate the exact thread without more time than I currently have." Gareth's expression shifted, something careful and considering crossing his features before he spoke again. "There's been talk," he said slowly, "among some of the kitchen staff and lower-ranked wolves. Nothing confirmed, nothing I would have brought to you without more certainty, but talk of strange marks appearing on someone's skin. Silver marks, they're saying, the kind the old stories warn about." Damien went very still. "Binding marks. That's the word being used, yes. I dismissed it at first as superstition, old wives' tales, the way these rumors usually turn out to be. But given what you're describing, the timing feels like more than coincidence." Damien rose from his chair so quickly it nearly toppled backward, his exhaustion forgotten entirely, replaced by a cold, sharpening focus he recognized from every crisis he had faced since taking the throne. Binding marks require significant bloodline power to create. That kind of magic doesn't exist casually within this pack. "No," Gareth agreed grimly, "it doesn't. Which is exactly why I hesitated to bring this to you before I had more information. There are very few wolves within our territory who would carry a bloodline capable of that kind of magic, and fewer still with any reason to use it against a lower-ranked pack member. The implication hung heavy and unspoken between them, and Damien felt something cold settle in his chest as understanding began to take shape, a possibility he had not wanted to consider, but could no longer avoid. "Find out who," he said, his voice dropping into the low, dangerous register that Gareth had learned over many years to take very seriously, quietly, carefully, but quickly. "If a wolf under my protection has been marked with forbidden magic within my own territory, I want to know everything before I confront anyone directly." Gareth nodded and rose to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at his king with an expression Damien could not quite read. "You should prepare yourself," Gareth said carefully, "for the possibility that the answer, when it comes, might be closer to the throne than either of us would like it to be." Damien did not respond because some deep, unwilling part of him had already reached the same uncomfortable conclusion, a suspicion he had been actively refusing to examine too closely since the ache in his bond thread first began. He thought of Seraphine, his Luna, chosen years ago through careful pack alliance rather than any true bond between them, a partnership built on strategy and mutual benefit rather than the kind of connection the old stories described as unbreakable. He thought of her careful smiles, her precise control over every social interaction within the pack house, the quiet ambition he had always respected in her, even as he privately acknowledged it, sometimes edged toward something colder than ambition alone. He told himself he was being paranoid, jumping to conclusions without evidence, the exhaustion of sleepless nights clouding his judgment. But the ache along his bond thread pulsed steadily on, refusing to be reasoned away, and Damien found himself unable to fully silence the growing certainty that whatever answer Gareth eventually brought back to him, it would change something fundamental about the careful order he had built his reign upon. He spent the following day in a state of restless distraction, moving through his usual duties, council meetings and border reports, and the endless small decisions required to govern a territory as large as his, while a significant part of his attention remained fixed on the ache in his bond thread and the investigation he had set Gareth to pursue quietly in the background. Several times throughout the day he caught himself watching Seraphine with an intensity he usually reserved for potential threats rather than his own Luna, studying the careful composure of her expression during their shared duties, searching for some crack in the polished surface she always presented to the world. She noticed his attention eventually, of course, because Seraphine noticed everything, and during a quiet moment between council sessions, she approached him with the polite, measured curiosity she always used when something had caught her interest. "You've been distracted today," she observed, settling into the chair across from his desk, with the easy confidence of someone entirely secure in her position. "Is something troubling you, my king?" Damien studied her for a long moment before answering, weighing his words carefully. "There's a disturbance within the pack bond, something I haven't been able to fully identify yet. It's been troubling me for days." Something flickered across Seraphine's expression, gone almost before he registered it, so brief and controlled he could not have sworn to what he saw. "How strange," she said smoothly. "I hope it resolves itself soon. A disturbance like that must be quite distracting from your duties." The response was perfectly reasonable, perfectly appropriate, and yet something about the careful neutrality of her tone struck Damien as wrong, in a way he could not fully articulate. He had known Seraphine for years, had learned to read the subtle variations in her voice and posture, the way any alpha learned to read the wolves closest to him, and this response felt rehearsed, in a way her responses rarely did. "Have you noticed anything unusual among the lower ranks recently?" he asked, watching her closely as he spoke, gauging every small shift in her expression. "Nothing comes to mind," Seraphine said, rising smoothly from her chair. "Though I confess, I don't spend a great deal of time among the lower quarters. Perhaps you should ask one of the kitchen staff. They tend to know everything happening within these walls." She offered him a polite smile before excusing herself, leaving Damien alone, with a growing unease he could not fully explain, a certainty, settling deeper into his chest, with every passing hour, that the answer Gareth was searching for would not be a comfortable one. That evening, as the sun began sinking low over the training yards, Gareth returned to Damien's study, with a grim expression that told Damien everything he needed to know before a single word had been spoken. "I found her," Gareth said quietly, closing the study door firmly behind him, the wolf carrying the marks. "Who?" Her name is Elena. Lower-ranked Omega. Trains in the yards. No significant bloodline connections. She spoke with the pack healer this morning, and word has already begun spreading among the staff about what Odette told her. Gareth's expression tightened further. Damien, the healer, confirmed it. Binding marks, forbidden bloodline magic, and there's only one wolf within our territory whose lineage carries that kind of power. Damien felt something cold and furious settle into the pit of his stomach, a rage beginning to build somewhere deep and controlled, the kind of anger he had spent years learning to master, rather than let master him. Elena, he repeated slowly, and something in the name struck a familiar chord in his memory. A face from the autumn trials rising unbidden into his thoughts. A skilled young fighter he had praised in front of the assembled pack without a second thought. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity, and Damien rose from his chair with the slow, deliberate movement of a man forcing himself to remain calm, despite every instinct screaming otherwise. "Bring her to the Great Hall this evening," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Bring Seraphine as well. It's time I learned the full truth of what has been happening within my own territory, and I want every wolf in this pack to witness it when I do." 3 weeks before Elena ever noticed the first mark on her skin, Seraphine had stood alone in her private chambers, long after the pack house had gone quiet for the night, staring at her own reflection in a tall silver mirror that had belonged to her mother, and to her mother's mother before that. The mirror was old, its frame carved with symbols most wolves in the current generation no longer recognized. Remnants of a bloodline tradition Seraphine had been taught in secret as a child, passed down through careful whispers and locked books rather than open teaching, because the kind of magic her family carried had been forbidden for good reason generations ago. She had never intended to use it. That was the truth she told herself. The story she had built carefully in her own mind, over years of quiet ambition and careful restraint. She had married into pack leadership through strategy rather than fate, chosen by the pack council as a suitable match for a young alpha who needed strong alliances rather than uncertain destiny, and she had accepted that arrangement with clear-eyed practicality. She did not expect love. She expected respect, position, and the kind of security that came with standing at the top of a pack hierarchy she had spent her entire life learning to navigate. What she had not expected was the particular, quiet humiliation of watching her own status slowly erode, not through any dramatic challenge or open rebellion, but through the accumulation of small moments that reminded her, again and again, that Damien had never truly chosen her, that their bond existed on paper and ceremony, rather than the deeper, undeniable connection the old stories described as a true mate bond. She had told herself for years that it did not matter, that practical arrangements built stronger foundations than fleeting fated connections, and for the most part she had believed it. Until the autumn trials, when she had watched Damien's attention catch and hold on a lower-ranked Omega with unremarkable lineage and no particular claim to notice, watched something flicker across his expression that she had never once seen directed toward her in all their years together. A genuine spark of interest, so brief, most of the assembled pack would not have noticed it at all. But Seraphine had spent years studying every subtle shift in Damien's demeanor, learning to read him the way a strategist studies a rival, and she had recognized immediately what that flicker meant, even before Damien himself had likely understood it. The fear that followed had surprised her with its intensity. She had built her entire identity around her position as Luna, around the careful respect and quiet authority that came with standing beside the Alpha King, and the thought of watching that position slip away, replaced by some unremarkable lower-ranked wolf who had done nothing more than fight well in a single sparring match, had ignited something in Seraphine she had not expected to feel, something dark and desperate and entirely unlike the composed woman she presented to the world. She had gone to the mirror that night for the first time in years, tracing the old symbols along its frame with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts at composure, and she had allowed herself, for the first time since childhood, to seriously consider using the knowledge her family had passed down through generations of careful secrecy. The binding marks were not meant for casual use, she knew that. Her grandmother had warned her of the dangers, the way the magic drew as much from the one who created it as from the one who received it, the careful balance required to use such power without consequence. But Seraphine had told herself it would be a small thing, a subtle discouragement, rather than any lasting harm, enough to remind this unremarkable Omega of her proper place within the pack hierarchy, before the situation could develop into anything more serious. She had convinced herself of this with the same careful, methodical logic she applied to every decision in her life, building justification upon justification until the plan felt reasonable rather than dangerous. And so, 3 days after the autumn trials, under cover of deepest night, Seraphine had slipped quietly through the lower quarters of the pack house, using old bloodline magic to trace her way to Elena's door, and had performed the binding ritual her grandmother had taught her so many years ago, watching with a strange mixture of guilt and grim satisfaction as the first faint silver marks began to bloom across the sleeping Omega's collarbone. She had told herself it would end there. A single warning, subtle and deniable, nothing more. But binding marks, once created, did not simply pause and wait for their creator's permission to stop growing. They continued to draw and spread according to their own dark logic, and Seraphine had known this, somewhere beneath the careful justifications she had built for herself, even as she chose to look away from the knowledge rather than confront what she had truly set into motion. In the days that followed, she had watched Elena from a careful distance, gathering small reports from staff members who did not know the significance of what they described, learning that the Omega had grown pale and tired, that she had begun wearing long sleeves despite the warm weather, that she had visited the pack healer's chambers early one morning looking deeply troubled. Each report had sent a fresh wave of guilt through Seraphine's chest, a guilt she suppressed each time with the same practiced skill she used to suppress every uncomfortable emotion that threatened her careful composure. It was not until the confrontation in the training yard, when she had approached Elena directly and watched the poorly concealed fear flash across the young Omega's face, that Seraphine allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had done. Standing there in the afternoon sun, watching Elena's hand rise instinctively to press against her own collarbone, Seraphine had felt something crack within her own carefully constructed sense of justification, a growing awareness that she had crossed a line far more serious than she had allowed herself to admit. But by then, turning back had already become impossible. Binding marks, once created, could only be released by their creator's deliberate choice, a public admission of forbidden magic that would mean the immediate loss of everything Seraphine had spent her life building, her position, her authority, potentially even her freedom, depending on how strictly the old laws were enforced within Damien's territory. And so, rather than confess and release the marks while there was still time to prevent serious harm, Seraphine had chosen instead to hope, desperately and against all reason, that the situation would somehow resolve itself before anyone discovered the truth. That hope had begun crumbling the moment word reached her, late in the afternoon following her encounter with Elena in the training yard, that the young Omega had visited Odette's healing chambers, and that whispers of binding marks and forbidden magic had already begun spreading through the pack house staff. Seraphine had sat alone in her private chambers as the news reached her, staring once more into her mother's silver mirror, watching her own composed reflection, with a growing sense of dread that no careful justification could fully suppress any longer. She knew, with the same clear-eyed practicality she had always applied to difficult situations, that discovery was likely now only a matter of time. She considered, briefly and desperately, attempting to release the binding marks herself before anyone confronted her directly, a private act of damage control that might allow her to maintain some fragile claim to ignorance if the timing worked in her favor. But releasing a binding mark required physical proximity to the one who carried it, a ritual that could not be performed in secret without significant risk of discovery. And Seraphine found herself trapped between the growing danger of exposure and the equally dangerous prospect of attempting to undo what she had done. She was still turning these desperate calculations over in her mind, still searching for some path forward that might allow her to salvage her position, when a firm knock sounded at her chamber door late that evening, followed by the measured voice of one of Damien's personal guards, informing her that the Alpha King required her immediate presence in the Great Hall. Seraphine rose slowly from her seat before the silver mirror, smoothing the pale blue fabric of her gown, with hands that had finally, after years of careful practice, begun to visibly tremble. She understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep into her chest, that whatever awaited her in the Great Hall that evening, the careful, controlled life she had built for herself, was almost certainly about to end. She thought, as she made her way slowly through the familiar corridors of the pack house she had called home for so many years, of her grandmother's warnings, spoken so long ago in hushed tones behind locked doors. Binding magic always demands its price, her grandmother had said, tracing the old symbols along the silver mirror's frame with knowing fingers. The only question is whether you pay it willingly, or whether it takes payment from you regardless of your choice. Seraphine had not fully understood those words as a child. She understood them now, walking toward whatever judgment awaited her in the great hall, with a clarity that offered no comfort at all. Elena spent the hours before the gathering in a state of frozen dread, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, while Mira paced back and forth across the small room, both of them replaying the same fearful questions over and over, without ever landing on an answer that brought either of them any comfort. Word of the summons had spread through the lower quarters like wildfire, and every wolf Elena passed in the corridors seemed to look at her a little too long, a little too knowingly, as though the truth of what was happening had already become common knowledge despite no formal announcement having been made. "You don't have to go," Mira said for perhaps the third time, stopping her pacing to kneel in front of Elena, gripping her hands tightly. "If this is truly about the marks, about Seraphine, you could be walking directly into danger. What if the Pack Council doesn't believe you? What if she finds some way to turn this against you instead?" "I don't have a choice," Elena said quietly, though her voice shook as she said it. "The summons came directly from the Alpha King, Mira. If I refuse to appear, that itself becomes a mark against me, whatever the outcome might have been otherwise." Mira's expression crumpled with worry, but she nodded slowly, understanding the truth of it even as she hated it. "Then I'm coming with you." "You don't have to." "I'm coming with you," Mira repeated, more firmly this time, rising to her feet and pulling Elena up alongside her. "Whatever happens in that hall tonight, you are not facing it alone." The walk to the Great Hall felt longer than Elena had ever remembered it being, though she had crossed the same corridors countless times before during ordinary pack gatherings. Tonight, every step felt weighted with significance. Every face she passed along the way seemed to track her movement with unusual interest, and by the time she reached the tall wooden doors leading into the hall itself, her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The Great Hall was already filling with pack members when Elena and Mira slipped inside, finding a place near the back among the lower-ranked wolves, who typically gathered along the edges of formal assemblies. The hall itself was an impressive space, high-ceilinged with heavy wooden beams and tall windows that let in the last golden light of evening. A raised dais at the far end, where the Alpha King traditionally addressed his pack during important gatherings. Elena had stood in this hall many times before, always somewhere near the back, always simply another face among the crowd. Tonight, despite her best efforts to remain unremarkable, she felt as though every eye in the room might eventually turn toward her before the evening was finished. She did not have to wait long to find out whether that fear was justified. The murmur of gathered conversation died away almost instantly as Damien entered the hall from a side door near the dais, his expression carved from stone, his presence filling the room with the particular weight that came from an Alpha King who had not slept properly in days and had spent that time growing increasingly, dangerously certain of a truth he did not yet want to fully confirm. Behind him, entering a moment later through the same door, came Seraphine, her posture perfectly composed despite the visible paleness of her face, her hands folded carefully in front of her pale blue gown. Damien moved to stand at the center of the dais, and the silence in the hall grew so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. When he finally spoke, his voice carried easily to every corner of the room, low and controlled, in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting would have. "I have called this gathering," Damien said, "because a serious matter has come to my attention, one that touches the very foundation of the laws this pack has upheld for generations. I will not waste time with lengthy explanations. I will simply ask, and I expect the truth." He turned, deliberately and slowly, to face Seraphine directly, and Elena watched a visible ripple of shock move through the gathered crowd as they registered the significance of his focus. The Alpha King was not addressing some distant threat or unnamed rumor. He was standing before his own Luna, in front of the entire assembled pack, and the tension in the hall grew thick enough to feel against the skin. 3 weeks ago, Damien continued, his gaze never leaving Seraphine's face, I praised the skill of a young Omega, named Elena, during the autumn trials, in front of this very pack. I did so without thought of consequence, as I have praised many wolves before her, for their skill and dedication. His voice hardened slightly. In the days since, that same Omega has begun carrying binding marks upon her skin, forbidden bloodline magic that our pack laws have explicitly outlawed for generations, magic capable of only a handful of wolves within our territory. A wave of shocked murmurs spread through the crowd, and Elena felt her face flush hot with the sudden, unwanted attention of dozens of eyes searching the room for her, though she remained hidden for the moment among the crowd at the back. Mira's hand found hers and gripped it tightly, a silent anchor against the rising panic threatening to overwhelm her. "Seraphine," Damien said, and his voice dropped lower still, carrying a warning that seemed to physically press against the air of the hall. "I ask you directly, before this entire pack, did you place binding marks upon Elena's skin?" For a long, agonizing moment, Seraphine said nothing at all. Elena watched from the back of the crowd as the Luna's composed expression flickered, just slightly, a crack finally beginning to show in the careful mask she had maintained for so many years. The silence stretched on, seconds feeling like minutes, until finally Seraphine drew a slow breath and lifted her chin with the last remaining fragments of her dignity. "I did," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the silent hall. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps and furious murmurs erupted throughout the gathered crowd, wolves turning to one another in shock to disbelief, the careful order of the formal assembly threatening to dissolve into chaos. Elena felt the room spinning slightly around her, the confirmation of her worst fears landing with a physical weight, despite having half expected this outcome, since the moment she first saw the marks on her own skin. But it was Damien's reaction that silenced the hall more effectively than any command could have. Elena watched, along with every other wolf present, as something shifted violently behind the Alpha King's controlled expression, his eyes flashing suddenly from their usual storm gray to a burning molten gold that signaled his wolf rising dangerously close to the surface. The air in the hall seemed to grow heavier, charged with a raw, barely contained power that made every wolf present instinctively lower their gaze or take an unconscious step backward. "You used forbidden magic," Damien said, his voice dropping into something barely human, rough and low with barely restrained fury, "against an innocent wolf under my protection. A wolf I praised, once, in passing, and you punished her for it, with magic, capable of slowly killing her." "Damien," Seraphine began, her composure finally cracking fully, fear breaking through the careful mask she had maintained for so long. "Do not," Damien said, and the sheer force behind those two quiet words silenced her instantly. His hands had begun to shake, claws visibly lengthening at his fingertips, despite his obvious efforts at control, and the wooden beam above the dais groaned audibly under some invisible pressure, radiating outward from his barely contained rage. Elena watched, frozen with a fear she could not fully name, as the Alpha King's control began visibly fraying before the entire assembled pack, his wolf clawing violently toward the surface, in response to a betrayal that struck at the very core of his responsibility, to protect every wolf within his territory. Around her, pack members began edging backward toward the hall's exits, the instinctive response of wolves recognizing the dangerous approach of an alpha, losing his grip on careful restraint. "Everyone out," Gareth's voice cut sharply through the rising panic, the head enforcer moving quickly to usher the gathered crowd toward the doors with practiced urgency. "Now, clear the hall, quickly." Elena felt Mira pulling at her arm, urging her toward the exit along with the rest of the fleeing crowd, but some frozen, disbelieving part of her remained fixed in place, watching as Damien's transformation continued to build with terrifying momentum, watching as the wooden beams overhead cracked further under the weight of power neither the hall's architecture nor the assembled pack had been built to withstand. "Elena, we have to go," Mira urged, finally breaking through her paralysis, and together, they stumbled toward the doors, along with the rest of the retreating crowd, the sound of splintering wood, and Seraphine's rising, panicked voice, echoing behind them, as they fled into the corridor beyond. The great hall's heavy doors swinging shut against a scene of raw, barely contained fury that Elena suspected would change the course of everything that followed, for herself, for Seraphine, and for the Alpha King whose careful control had finally, catastrophically, broken. Outside the great hall, the corridor had become a crush of frightened wolves pressing toward the main doors of the pack house, and Elena found herself swept along with the crowd until Mira pulled her sideways into a narrow alcove, away from the worst of the panic. Through the thick wooden doors behind them, muffled but unmistakable, came the sound of splintering timber and a low, rolling growl that did not sound entirely human anymore. "He's shifting," Mira whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "Fully shifting, right there in the hall." Elena pressed her back against the cool stone wall of the alcove, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. She had never witnessed an alpha lose control so completely, had only heard stories of what happened when a wolf's fury outpaced his ability to contain it, stories that always ended with destruction, and, sometimes, tragedy. The thought that she was, however unintentionally, the cause of this particular loss of control settled over her like a physical weight. Gareth emerged from the hall a few minutes later, his shirt torn at one shoulder, a fresh scratch visible along his forearm, his expression grim but controlled, despite the obvious danger he had just walked away from. He scanned the retreating crowd quickly, and Elena watched his gaze land on her with unmistakable recognition. "You're Elena," he said, crossing the corridor toward her and Mira with quick, purposeful strides. "Yes," Elena managed, her voice barely steady. "The king needs to see the marks himself, once he's regained control," Gareth said, glancing back toward the hall doors, from which the sounds of splintering wood and low, furious growling continued. "He won't fully believe the danger until he's confirmed it directly. I need you to wait nearby, but somewhere safe, until he's calmed enough to receive you." "Is he going to hurt her?" Seraphine's name went unspoken, but Elena understood immediately who Gareth meant. Something in her chest twisted uncomfortably at the question, a complicated tangle of fear, and something that was not quite sympathy, but was not entirely its absence either. Gareth's jaw tightened. The law regarding forbidden magic is clear and severe, but the king will not act rashly, whatever his wolf might currently want. He respects pack law too deeply for that, even now. He gestured toward a small side chamber off the main corridor, usually reserved for private council meetings. "Wait there. I'll come for you when it's safe." Elena and Mira retreated into the small chamber, the heavy wooden door doing little to muffle the distant sounds still echoing from the great hall. Elena sat on the edge of a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Mira paced in front of the narrow window, occasionally glancing outside toward the courtyard, where a growing number of pack members had gathered, drawn by curiosity and alarm in equal measure. It felt like hours passed, though Elena suspected it had truly been closer to one, before the sounds from the great hall finally began to quiet. The low, furious growling faded gradually into something more controlled, and eventually silence settled over the corridor beyond their small chamber. Elena's heart had barely begun to slow when the door opened and Gareth reappeared, his expression still grave, but no longer carrying the same urgent alarm. "He's regained his human form," Gareth said. "Barely. The hall is in ruins, but no one was seriously harmed. He's asked for you directly, Elena, alone, if you're willing." Elena's stomach dropped. She glanced at Mira, who looked equally uncertain, torn between her instinct to protect her friend and the understanding that this was not a request Elena could reasonably refuse. "I'll be right outside," Mira said finally, squeezing Elena's hand once more before releasing it. "If you need me, just call." Elena followed Gareth back through the corridor, past the wide-open doors of the great hall, where she could see the extent of the damage even from a distance. Two of the heavy wooden support beams had cracked clean through, one of the tall windows had shattered entirely, and deep gouges marked the stone floor near the center of the dais, where claws had raked across solid rock as though it were soft earth. The sight sent a fresh wave of unease through her, a physical reminder of just how much power the Alpha King truly commanded when his control finally broke. Damien stood near the far end of the ruined hall, his back to the door, still dressed in the torn remnants of the formal clothing he had worn to address the gathering, his shoulders rising and falling with the visible effort of forcing himself back toward calm. Gareth gave Elena a small nod of encouragement before stepping back, leaving her to approach alone across the damaged floor. "Your Majesty," Elena said softly, when she was close enough that she felt certain he could hear her despite not turning around. Her voice trembled slightly, despite her best efforts at composure. Damien turned slowly, and Elena found herself unprepared for the raw exhaustion and lingering, barely contained fury still visible in his expression, his eyes not yet fully returned to their usual storm gray, still carrying faint traces of molten gold at the edges. He studied her for a long moment in silence, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, despite every instinct urging her to look away, to make herself smaller, less noticeable, the way she had trained herself to do throughout her entire life, within the pack hierarchy. "Show me," Damien said finally, his voice rough but quieter than she had expected, none of the fury from moments before directed at her specifically. Elena's hands trembled as she reached up and carefully pulled aside the collar of her tunic, revealing the marks that had grown darker and more pronounced since Odette had first examined them, spreading now well past her collarbone toward the base of her throat. Damien's expression tightened visibly at the sight, his jaw clenching hard enough that Elena could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. He stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and Elena found herself holding perfectly still as he reached out with careful, controlled movements to examine the marks more closely, his fingers hovering just above her skin, without quite touching it. "How long have you carried these?" he asked quietly. "3 days, Your Majesty. They started small, along my collarbone. They've been spreading since. Does it cause you pain?" Elena hesitated, some instinct urging her to minimize the truth, to avoid burdening her king with more concern than necessary. But something in his expression, the careful, focused attention he was giving her answer, convinced her that honesty mattered more here than her usual instinct toward invisibility. "Constant pain, Your Majesty. It's grown worse each day." Something shifted in Damien's expression at her answer, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt, quickly suppressed beneath his returning composure. "This should never have happened to you," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion Elena could not fully identify. "Not within my territory, not under my protection. I am sorry, Elena, that I failed to see this sooner." The unexpected apology, offered so directly by a king who owed no explanation to a lower-ranked Omega, caught Elena entirely off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, though she was not entirely certain what words might follow, when Damien's fingers finally made contact with the edge of the marks along her collarbone, gentle and careful, clearly intending only to examine the extent of the damage. The moment his skin touched hers, something unexpected happened, a sharp, unmistakable jolt of warmth that traveled through Elena's entire body, entirely different from the constant burning ache of the binding marks themselves. She gasped softly, and across from her, Damien's eyes widened with obvious shock, his own breath catching audibly, as the same sensation clearly struck him in return. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, both too stunned by the sudden, undeniable pull of recognition passing between them to process what it might mean. Elena had heard stories of true mate bonds her entire life, tales told among lower-ranked wolves, who dreamed of finding a connection that transcended pack hierarchy and status entirely. But she had never expected, not for a single moment, that such a bond might exist for her, let alone with the Alpha King himself. Damien withdrew his hand slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on her face, with an intensity that made Elena's pulse race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "That was not simply my concern for a wolf under my protection," he said quietly, almost to himself, as though working through the implications, even as he spoke them aloud. "I felt it too," Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertain what such an admission might mean for either of them, given everything else already unfolding around them that evening. Before either of them could say anything further, footsteps echoed from the hall's entrance, and Gareth's voice called out with careful urgency. "Your Majesty, the council has gathered. They're awaiting your decision regarding Seraphine's confinement." Damien's expression shifted instantly, the raw vulnerability of the moment before folding back beneath the controlled authority of his position, though Elena noticed his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than strictly necessary, before he finally turned to address Gareth. "I'll come immediately," he said, then glanced back toward Elena, with an expression that carried both apology and promise in equal measure. "This conversation is not finished, Elena, but there are matters requiring my attention tonight that cannot wait. Please, remain within the pack house under guard, until I've had time to properly address everything that has happened." For your own safety. Elena nodded, still reeling from the unexpected revelation of moments before, and watched as Damien strode from the ruined hall to address whatever judgment awaited Seraphine, leaving Elena alone amid the wreckage with a single, overwhelming realization settling slowly over her. Whatever she had believed about her place within this pack, however invisible and unremarkable she had trained herself to remain throughout her life, that careful anonymity had ended completely and irreversibly the moment Damien's hand touched the marks upon her skin. The council chamber sat adjacent to the ruined Great Hall, a smaller, more private room, reserved for matters requiring careful deliberation rather than public spectacle. By the time Damien arrived, the pack elders had already assembled around the long wooden table at its center, their expressions ranging from grave concern to poorly disguised shock at the events that had just unfolded before the entire gathered pack. Nathaniel, the eldest among them and a wolf who had advised Damien's father before him, rose from his seat as the Alpha King entered, his weathered face lined with the particular gravity reserved for matters of serious pack law. "Your Majesty," Nathaniel said, inclining his head respectfully, "we have much to discuss." Damien took his place at the head of the table, forcing himself to breathe slowly and steadily, despite the storm of emotion still churning beneath his controlled exterior. The revelation in the ruined hall moments earlier, the undeniable jolt of connection he had felt the instant his skin touched Elena's, remained at the forefront of his thoughts, even as duty demanded his full attention turned toward the more immediate crisis at hand. "Where is Seraphine now?" he asked. "Confined to her private chambers, under guard," Gareth answered, from his position near the door. "She has not resisted, and has made no attempt to flee. I believe she understands the severity of what she has admitted to." "Good," Damien said, though the word carried little satisfaction. He turned his attention to the assembled elders, several of whom had served the pack's council for decades, and carried deep knowledge of the old laws that Damien himself had only studied in careful preparation for moments exactly like this one. "I need to understand fully what pack law demands in cases of confirmed binding magic used against an innocent wolf." Nathaniel exchanged a brief, weighted glance with the other elders before responding. "The old laws are unambiguous, Your Majesty, though rarely invoked in recent generations, since the practice of binding magic largely faded from use. A wolf found guilty of placing forbidden binding marks upon another, without cause of self-defense or formal pack challenge, faces exile from the territory at minimum. In cases where the victim suffers lasting harm, the old laws permit far harsher consequences, up to and including execution, depending on the severity of the crime and the judgment of the presiding alpha." The word execution settled heavily over the chamber, and Damien felt his jaw tighten involuntarily at the thought, despite the raw fury that had consumed him only an hour earlier in the Great Hall. Whatever Seraphine had done, whatever betrayal she had committed against both pack law and the trust he had placed in her as his Luna, the idea of ending her life entirely felt like a decision that deserved more careful consideration than his fury alone could provide. "What of the victim's condition?" asked one of the other elders, a sharp-eyed woman named Edith who had long served as the council's primary interpreter of pack law. "Binding marks of significant strength can cause lasting harm if left unaddressed long enough. Has the young Omega been fully examined?" The healer confirmed the marks were spreading rapidly, Damien said. "I saw them myself this evening. They've progressed significantly in only 3 days." "Then time matters more than punishment in this moment," Edith said firmly. "Binding marks can typically only be released through one of 2 methods, Your Majesty. Either the Creator releases them willingly, through a formal ritual requiring physical proximity to the victim, or a wolf, carrying equal or greater bloodline authority, performs an intervention capable of overriding the original binding. Given the severity of Seraphine's crime, I would advise caution in trusting her cooperation for a willing release, however much such cooperation might benefit the victim." Damien considered this carefully, turning the problem over in his mind with the same methodical focus he applied to matters of border security or resource allocation, though the stakes here felt considerably more personal than any typical council business. What would a formal release ritual require? The Creator must touch the marks directly and speak the words of release, drawing the binding back into themselves, rather than leaving it to continue feeding on the victim, Edith explained. "It is not without risk to the one performing the release, as the magic does not simply disappear, it returns to its source. But it is the fastest and most complete method of ending the harm being done. And if Seraphine refuses to cooperate? Then we would need to identify another method, Edith said, though her expression suggested she considered this the less desirable outcome. Older texts reference the possibility of a true mate bond overriding binding magic entirely, though such cases are exceedingly rare in recorded pack history, given how rarely true bonds and binding magic intersect at all. Damien felt his pulse quicken at the mention of a true mate bond, the memory of that unexpected jolt of connection still vivid in his mind, though he said nothing of it to the assembled council, uncertain how to explain a revelation he himself had not yet fully processed. "I will speak with Seraphine directly," he said instead, rising from his seat with renewed purpose. "Tonight, before this situation is allowed to worsen any further. Gareth, arrange for me to see her immediately." The council chamber fell into a flurry of quiet discussion, as Damien made his way toward the door, Nathaniel calling after him with one final piece of counsel. "Your Majesty, whatever you decide regarding Seraphine's fate, I would urge you to consider the full weight of pack law carefully before rendering final judgment. The pack will be watching closely, and precedents set here will shape how such crimes are handled for generations to come." Damien acknowledged the advice with a brief nod before continuing toward Seraphine's private chambers, Gareth falling into step beside him as they moved through corridors, still buzzing with the nervous energy of pack members, processing the evening's dramatic events. The guards posted outside Seraphine's door stepped aside as Damien approached, and he entered to find his Luna, or the woman who had until tonight held that title, sitting rigidly upright in a chair near her window, her composure visibly more fragile than he had ever witnessed in all their years together. "Damien," Seraphine said quietly, rising to her feet as he entered, though something in her posture suggested she expected whatever conversation followed to determine the entirety of her remaining future. "Sit," Damien said, his voice carrying none of the fury from earlier that evening, replaced now by a cold, controlled exhaustion that felt somehow more difficult to bear. Seraphine obeyed, and Damien remained standing, studying her for a long moment before speaking again. "The council has explained to me what pack law requires for your crime. Exile, at minimum. Execution, if the harm proves severe enough." Seraphine paled further, though she did not look away from his gaze, some last remnant of her careful pride refusing to fully crumble even now. "I understand the consequences of what I've done. Do you?" Damien's voice sharpened slightly despite his efforts at control. "Elena carries marks that have spread significantly in only 3 days, Seraphine. She suffers constant pain. She could have died, slowly and painfully, because you feared losing status over a single careless compliment I offered during a sparring match." "I know," Seraphine said, and something in her voice cracked, a rare crack in the composure she had maintained so carefully for years. "I have regretted it every day since I performed the binding. I told myself it would be a small thing, a subtle warning, nothing more. I was wrong, and I have no defense to offer beyond that admission." Damien studied her for a long moment, weighing the genuine remorse he heard in her voice against the severity of the harm she had caused, the deliberate, forbidden choice she had made, regardless of how much she now regretted its consequences. "I need you to release the binding," he said finally. "Tonight. Willingly, before this situation grows any more dangerous for Elena." Seraphine's expression flickered with something like relief, followed quickly by uncertainty. "The release requires physical proximity to her, direct contact with the marks." "Then we will arrange it," Damien said firmly. "Your cooperation in releasing her from this harm will be considered in whatever judgment the council ultimately renders regarding your fate. But know this clearly, Seraphine. Whatever leniency your cooperation might earn you, our years of partnership as Alpha and Luna have ended tonight, regardless of what final punishment the law demands." Seraphine nodded slowly, accepting this with a quiet dignity that Damien found himself unable to fully resent, despite everything. "I will release her," she said. "Tonight, whenever you arrange it. I never intended for things to progress this far, Damien. I want you to know that, even if it changes nothing about what I've already done." Damien said nothing further, turning instead to arrange the details of the release ritual with Gareth, his mind already moving ahead toward the delicate work of undoing the damage Seraphine's jealousy had caused, while beneath his focused determination, the memory of that unexpected jolt of connection with Elena continued pulsing steadily at the edges of his thoughts, a truth he knew he could not avoid confronting for much longer, whatever else the night still held in store. Elena waited in the small side chamber with Mira, both of them exhausted from the emotional weight of the evening, when Gareth returned to explain what the council had decided and what would be required to finally free her from the binding marks. Mira's relief at hearing there was a path toward healing was immediate and visible, though Elena found her own reaction more complicated, a tangle of hope and lingering unease at the thought of standing close to Seraphine again after everything that had happened between them, however indirectly. "It has to happen soon," Gareth explained, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension still lingering from the evening's events. "The longer the marks remain active, the more they draw from your strength. The council has arranged for the release to take place within the hour, in the healing chambers, with witnesses present to ensure everything proceeds properly." Elena nodded, though her hands had begun trembling again at the thought of what lay ahead. Mira squeezed her shoulder gently, offering what comfort she could, before the three of them made their way toward Odette's chambers, where the healer had already been informed, and was preparing the space for whatever the release ritual required. Seraphine arrived a few minutes later, escorted by 2 guards, her composure notably more fragile than Elena had ever witnessed in their previous encounters. For a long moment, the 2 women simply looked at each other across the dim, herb-scented room, and Elena found herself surprised by the absence of the fear she had expected to feel. What remained instead was something closer to wary curiosity, a desire to understand rather than simply condemn. "I owe you an apology," Seraphine said quietly, before anyone else had spoken, her voice lacking entirely the smooth, controlled quality Elena remembered from their previous conversations. "There is no justification I can offer that makes what I did acceptable. I acted out of fear and jealousy, and you suffered for it. I am sorry, Elena, more than I know how to properly express." Elena considered the apology carefully, weighing it against the pain she had carried these past 3 days, the fear that had consumed her waking hours, the uncertainty about her own future within the pack. She did not feel ready to forgive fully, not yet, perhaps not for a long while, but she recognized something genuine in Seraphine's admission, a rawness that felt different from the careful composure the Luna had always presented before. "Thank you for releasing me from this," Elena said finally, choosing honesty over false warmth, honesty over false anger as well. "I hope you understand why forgiveness will take time, if it comes at all." "I understand," Seraphine said simply, and something in her expression suggested she had expected nothing less. Odette guided them through the necessary preparations, explaining quietly to Elena what she should expect during the release ritual, a process that would require Seraphine to press her palm directly against the marks and speak specific old words that would draw the binding magic back into herself, ending its slow drain on Elena's strength. Elena settled onto a low stool near the fire, pulling aside her collar to expose the marks that had spread further still since Damien had examined them earlier that evening, dark silver lines now curling almost to the base of her throat. Seraphine knelt before her, and Elena watched the older woman's hands tremble slightly as she raised them toward the marks, a visible reminder that this ritual carried real risk for the one performing it, that Seraphine was not simply undoing a mistake without cost to herself. Elena held herself very still as Seraphine's palm finally made contact with her skin, and immediately felt a strange, pulling sensation begin somewhere deep beneath the marks, as though something that had taken root inside her was slowly, painfully being drawn back out. Seraphine's voice, when she began speaking the old words of release, carried a weight and cadence unlike her usual polished speech, ancient syllables that seemed to hang heavy in the herb-scented air of the healing chamber. Elena felt the pulling sensation intensify, sharp and strange but no longer painful, in the burning way the marks had ached these past 3 days, and slowly, gradually, she watched the silver lines along her collarbone begin to fade, retreating back toward the point where Seraphine's palm still pressed against her skin. The process took several long minutes, during which Seraphine's expression grew increasingly strained, small beads of sweat forming along her hairline despite the cool evening air, her breathing growing labored as the binding magic returned to its source. Finally, with one last murmured phrase, the final traces of silver light faded entirely from Elena's skin, leaving only smooth, unmarked flesh, where the binding marks had spread only moments before. Seraphine sat back heavily, visibly drained, one of the guards moving quickly to steady her as she swayed slightly on her knees. "It's done," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The binding is fully released. You should feel the pain fade within the hour, and your strength should return over the following days." Elena pressed her hand against her now unmarked collarbone, feeling the absence of pain for the first time in days, a relief so profound, it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Mira embraced her immediately, careless of formal propriety, and Elena allowed herself to simply breathe for a moment, absorbing the reality that the immediate danger had finally passed. It was in that quiet moment of relief that the chamber door opened and Damien entered, having clearly waited nearby, to confirm the ritual's success himself. His eyes moved immediately to Elena, scanning her exposed collarbone with obvious relief at the sight of unmarked skin, before turning to observe Seraphine's exhausted, guard-supported form, with an expression far more complicated. "It's finished," Odette confirmed, moving to check Elena's pulse and breathing, with practiced efficiency. "The marks are fully released. She'll need rest and proper food over the coming days to fully recover her strength, but the danger has passed." Damien nodded, visible tension easing from his shoulders for the first time since Elena had first seen him earlier that evening. He turned to address Seraphine directly, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of residual anger and grudging acknowledgement of her cooperation. "Your willingness to release the binding will be considered by the council when they render final judgment tomorrow. You'll remain confined to your chambers under guard until that decision is made." Seraphine nodded wearily, allowing herself to be helped to her feet and escorted from the chamber, leaving Damien, Elena, Mira, and Odette alone in the quiet, herb-scented room. For a long moment, no one spoke, the weight of the evening's events settling slowly over all of them. "I need to speak with Elena privately," Damien said finally, glancing toward Mira and Odette with a request that carried the weight of a command despite its polite phrasing. Mira hesitated, glancing toward Elena for confirmation, and Elena offered a small nod of reassurance. "I'll be fine," she said quietly, and Mira, though clearly reluctant, allowed herself to be guided from the room by Odette, leaving Elena alone with the Alpha King for the first time since the strange, unexpected jolt of connection they had shared in the ruined Great Hall earlier that evening. Damien moved to sit on the low stool across from her, close enough that Elena could feel the warmth radiating from him, though he made no move to touch her again, clearly mindful of what had happened the last time skin had met skin between them. He asked, his voice gentler now than she had ever heard it, stripped of the authority and control he wore so constantly in front of the wider pack. "Relieved," Elena admitted, exhausted, still trying to understand everything that's happened tonight. She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Including what happened between us, in the hall." Damien's expression grew serious, thoughtful, and he studied her for a long moment, before responding. "I've felt disturbances along the pack bond before. Wolves in distress, reaching out unconsciously for their alpha's protection. This was different. This felt personal, direct, unlike anything I've experienced with any other wolf under my care." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "I believe what passed between us tonight was the recognition of a true mate bond, Elena. I don't say this lightly, and I understand it changes everything, arriving as it has amid so much chaos and danger." Elena's heart raced at the confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect, a truth that felt simultaneously overwhelming and, somewhere deep beneath her exhaustion and lingering fear, quietly, undeniably right. "I don't know what that means," she admitted honestly, "for either of us." "For the pack, neither do I, fully," Damien said, offering her a small, tired smile that transformed his exhausted expression into something softer, more human, than the commanding presence he projected before the wider pack. "But I would like the chance to find out, Elena, when you're ready. There's no urgency tonight, beyond your rest and recovery, but I don't intend to let this connection between us simply fade away unexamined." Elena found herself, despite everything, offering a small, tentative smile in return, the first genuine moment of hope she had felt in what seemed like a very long time. Whatever complications still lay ahead, whatever the council's final judgment regarding Seraphine might bring, Whatever challenges awaited a bond between an Alpha King and a lower-ranked Omega with no powerful bloodline to support her, Elena found herself, for the first time since waking, with strange silver marks upon her skin, looking toward the future with something other than fear. The council reconvened the following afternoon, and word of the previous night's dramatic events had spread so thoroughly through the pack that a large crowd gathered outside the meeting chamber, despite the proceedings being formally closed to general attendance. Elena stood among the witnesses called to testify, her strength largely restored after a full night of rest, and the careful herbal remedies Odette had continued providing throughout the morning, though the memory of everything that had happened remained vivid and unsettling in her mind. Nathaniel opened the proceedings with a formal recitation of the events as they had unfolded, the confirmed use of forbidden binding magic, Seraphine's admission of guilt before the assembled pack, and her subsequent cooperation in releasing the binding before serious lasting harm could occur. Elena was called to describe her experience, and she did so carefully, honestly, neither exaggerating her suffering nor minimizing it, simply offering the truth as she had lived it over those difficult 3 days. Seraphine, seated before the council with 2 guards positioned nearby, listened to the proceedings, with a composure that had returned somewhat since the previous night's exhaustion, though something fundamental had clearly shifted in her demeanor, a quiet acceptance, replacing the careful control she had maintained for so many years. "The law is clear regarding the minimum consequence for this crime," Edith said, addressing the assembled council members after all testimony had been heard. "Exile from this territory, effective immediately, with no right of return without formal pack approval, which given the severity of the crime, this council would be unlikely to grant in the future. There is also the matter of execution to consider," another elder pointed out, "given the severity of harm the marks caused before their release." The chamber fell silent as the council weighed this possibility, and Elena felt her stomach tighten at the thought, an unexpected discomfort, given everything Seraphine had done to her. She had not forgiven the former Luna, not fully, perhaps not ever completely, but the thought of her death felt like a weight Elena did not wish to carry, a consequence disproportionate to genuine, if belated, remorse. "May I speak?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice as she rose from her seat among the witnesses. Damien, seated at the head of the council table, inclined his head in permission, his expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious interest with which he watched her. "I don't believe execution serves justice here," Elena said, choosing her words carefully, as every eye in the chamber turned toward her. "What was done to me was wrong, and dangerous, and I won't pretend otherwise. But Seraphine chose, in the end, to release me from the binding, at real cost to herself, and she has expressed genuine remorse for her actions. I would ask the council to consider exile sufficient, rather than the more severe punishment available under the old laws." A murmur moved through the assembled council members, and Elena watched Seraphine's expression shift with visible, startled gratitude, an emotion the former Luna made no attempt to hide. Damien studied Elena for a long moment, something like quiet pride flickering across his features, before he turned his attention back to the council. "The victim's wishes carry significant weight in matters of this nature," Nathaniel said slowly, considering the room's mood. "Given Seraphine's cooperation in releasing the binding, and Elena's clearly stated position, I would recommend the council consider exile as sufficient consequence, effective immediately." The council deliberated briefly among themselves, quiet murmured exchanges Elena could not fully follow, before Nathaniel finally rose to deliver their formal decision. "This council finds Seraphine guilty of using forbidden binding magic against an innocent wolf, in violation of ancient pack law. The sentence is immediate and permanent exile from this territory, with forfeiture of all titles and standing within this pack. She will be escorted beyond the territory borders by sundown today." Seraphine rose slowly from her seat, her composure holding despite the obvious weight of the moment, and turned first to address the council with a formal bow of acceptance, before her gaze finally settled on Elena. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me mercy I did not necessarily deserve. I will not forget it." Elena said nothing in return, uncertain what response felt appropriate, but offered a small nod that acknowledged the moment, without pretending toward a warmth she did not yet feel. Seraphine turned then to Damien, and something passed between the two of them, years of complicated partnership and mutual respect, condensing into a final, wordless farewell, before the guards moved to escort her from the chamber, toward packing whatever belongings she would be permitted to carry beyond the territory borders. The chamber slowly emptied following the formal conclusion of proceedings, pack members and council elders alike dispersing to process the dramatic resolution of the crisis that had consumed the pack house for the better part of 2 days. Elena found herself lingering near the now empty council table, still absorbing the weight of everything that had happened, when Damien approached, having dismissed the last of the departing council members. "That took considerable courage," he said quietly, "speaking as you did before the full council." "I didn't want her death on my conscience," Elena admitted. "Whatever she did to me, it felt like enough had already been lost." Damien studied her with an expression that carried genuine admiration, something Elena still found difficult to fully believe was directed at her, given how invisible she had trained herself to remain throughout her entire life within the pack hierarchy. "You continue to surprise me," he said, "first with your skill in the training yard, and now with your wisdom in matters of justice. I begin to understand why the bond between us formed as it did." Elena felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the observation, an unfamiliar but not unwelcome sensation, given the exhaustion and fear that had dominated her emotions these past several days. "What happens now?" she asked. "For the pack, for us." Damien considered the question carefully before answering. "The pack will need a new Luna, eventually, though there's no urgency in that decision, beyond what feels right for both of us. As for what happens between us, that depends entirely on what you want, Elena. A true mate bond is a powerful thing, but it doesn't demand anything of either of us that we're not ready to give freely." Elena appreciated the careful respect in his words, the absence of any assumption that their bond obligated her toward any particular future, and she found herself, in this quiet moment, following so much chaos and danger, genuinely considering what she wanted for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I would like the chance to know you," she said finally, "honestly, beyond the crisis that brought us together, properly, without the shadow of danger hanging over every conversation." Damien's answering smile carried a warmth Elena suspected few beyond his closest advisors had ever witnessed, the careful control he wore before the wider pack softening into something more genuine, more human. "I would like that very much," he said. "Perhaps we could begin with something as simple as a proper conversation, over a meal, without council chambers or ruined halls involved." Elena laughed softly, the sound surprising her with its ease given everything the past several days had held, and found herself, for the first time since waking, with strange marks upon her skin, looking forward to whatever came next with genuine, quiet hope rather than fear. 3 months passed following Seraphine's exile, and the pack house gradually settled into a new rhythm, one built around a season of careful rebuilding, rather than the sudden chaos that had briefly consumed it. The great hall had been fully repaired, its cracked beams replaced with fresh timber, its shattered window restored with clear new glass that let in even more of the golden autumn light than before. Elena had watched the reconstruction with quiet satisfaction, each time her duties brought her past the hall's tall doors, a physical reminder that even the deepest damage could, with patience and care, be made whole again. Her own recovery had followed a similar path. The physical strength drained by the binding marks had fully returned within the first 2 weeks, restored through Odette's careful herbal remedies and simple, steady rest. The deeper healing, the slow process of learning to trust her own safety within the pack hierarchy again, had taken considerably longer, though Elena found that healing too, gradually taking hold as the weeks passed. Much of that healing, she had come to recognize, was tied inseparably to the growing bond between herself and Damien, a connection that had deepened steadily since that first, startling jolt of recognition in the ruined Great Hall. They had spent countless hours together in the months since, careful, deliberate time spent building understanding between them, beyond the crisis that had first drawn them together. Elena had learned that Damien's commanding presence, before the wider pack, concealed a thoughtful, genuinely curious mind, someone who asked careful questions and listened intently to her answers, who valued her perspective on pack matters, with a seriousness she had never expected any alpha to extend toward an omega of her humble standing. Damien, in turn, had learned that Elena's quiet, careful nature concealed a sharp intelligence and quiet courage that had only grown more apparent the more time they spent together, qualities that had first caught his attention during the autumn trials and had only deepened his respect for her in the months since. Their bond had grown naturally, without pressure or expectation, exactly as Damien had promised that first evening in the empty council chamber. And Elena found herself, more each day, genuinely and unreservedly happy, in a way she had never quite believed herself capable of feeling. The formal bonding ceremony, when it finally arrived on a crisp morning in early winter, drew the entire pack together in the newly repaired Great Hall, sunlight streaming through the restored windows, to illuminate the gathered crowd in warm golden light. Elena stood at the center of the hall beside Damien, dressed in pale silver fabric that Mira had helped her choose weeks earlier, her nervousness tempered by the steady, reassuring presence of the man beside her, whose hand found hers with quiet confidence, as Nathaniel began the ancient words of the bonding ritual. The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur for Elena, the formal recitation of vows, the exchange of a simple silver band that marked her new status within the pack, the ritual bite Damien placed with gentle care along her shoulder that sealed their bond permanently, a mark utterly unlike the binding marks that had once brought her so much fear and pain, this one carrying instead a warmth that spread through her entire body, like sunlight rather than fire. When the ceremony concluded and Nathaniel formally presented her to the assembled pack as their new Luna, the hall erupted in genuine warm applause, a stark contrast to the fearful silence that had gripped the same space months earlier during the crisis that had first brought her and Damien together. Elena scanned the crowd and found Mira near the front, tears of happiness visible even from a distance, and beside her, Odette, offering a small, satisfied nod that acknowledged how far Elena had traveled since that first frightened morning in the healing chambers. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had concluded and the pack house had settled into quiet contentment, Elena found herself standing beside Damien on the balcony, overlooking the training yards, where their story had first, unknowingly, begun months earlier. The night air carried the crisp promise of approaching winter, stars scattered thick and bright across the clear sky above them. "Do you regret any of it?" Damien asked quietly, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders as they looked out over the peaceful, moonlit territory below. "The fear, the danger, everything that happened before we found our way to this moment?" Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over the months since that first terrifying morning, when she had woken to find strange marks blooming across her skin, the fear and uncertainty that had followed, the courage it had taken to speak the truth before an entire assembled pack, the complicated mercy she had extended toward the woman who had caused her so much suffering. "I wouldn't wish the pain of it on anyone," she said finally, honestly, "but I can't fully regret a path that led me here, to you, to this life I never imagined I'd have the chance to build." Damien turned to face her fully, his expression carrying the same warmth she had grown to treasure in the months since their bond first formed, a warmth that felt increasingly like home with every passing day. "I promise you, Elena," he said, his voice low and steady with quiet conviction, "that no wolf within this territory will ever again suffer the way you did, hidden and unprotected within walls meant to keep them safe. I failed to see the danger gathering around you before it was nearly too late, and I will spend the rest of my reign ensuring such a failure never happens again." Elena reached up to gently touch the mark along her shoulder, the permanent reminder of their bond, warm and steady beneath her fingertips, utterly unlike the cold, burning silver that had once marked her skin with fear rather than belonging. "We'll ensure it together," she said softly, and Damien's answering smile, warm and genuine, beneath the scattered stars above them, told her everything she needed to know about the future stretching out ahead of them both. Below the balcony, the pack house settled into peaceful nighttime quiet, the training yards empty and still beneath the moonlight, the great hall's restored windows glowing faintly with the last embers of the evening celebration. Somewhere beyond the territory borders, Seraphine walked whatever new path her exile had set her upon, carrying with her the hard-won lessons of jealousy's cost and mercy's unexpected grace. And within the walls of the pack house she had once called home, its new Luna stood beside her Alpha King, no longer the invisible, overlooked Omega she had trained herself to become, but a woman fully seen, fully valued, and fully, finally, safe. The story of the marks that had once threatened to destroy her had become, in the end, the story of how she was found, protected, and loved, exactly as she was, a truth Elena carried forward into every peaceful morning that followed, grateful for a path she had never expected, but would not, in the end, have chosen to walk any differently.